Now let's talk with John Killinger. Wonderful to see you again, John.
Thanks. My pleasure to
Your
be here, Lydia.
message, we've just heard, is a radical call to action, to discipleship, to reduce human suffering. It reminds me of the essay by French writer Charles Baudelaire, The Eyes of the Poor, who are looking in on a cold night into a restaurant at a couple having dinner, and the husband looks back at them into their eyes and through the glass sees them with compassion. His wife, on the other hand, says, "Can't somebody get rid of them?" And he looks into the eyes of his wife and realizes he does not read his thoughts there. Are we avoiding the eyes of the poor more since the near financial Armageddon in 2008?
I'm not sure that we are, but certainly there's so many of them, they may in some way inure us to their plight. I mean, on every hand, I think every one of us knows people right now who are suffering, wondering where their next paycheck will come from, or whether they'll be able to meet their credit card needs or anything. I mean, it's the most terrible time I've seen in my lifetime. And I think you say it's a radical call. The gospel always was more radical than we suspected. And I think in a time like this, we have the opportunity to hear Christ calling us to do more than we might have heard in a long time, if we're listening.
Seems like these days people talk about when they do hit economic hard times, when they're in bankruptcy or they've lost a job, they see the people around them kind of pull back and avoid them. It's as if we're afraid to look at the poor because we're nervous about our own situation.
That may be true, Lydia, and I think people are always embarrassed when anything happens to their friends, whether it's cancer or divorce or whatever. People naturally sort of recoil. They don't quite know how to enter in that human situation and help. And maybe we all need to learn to be more vulnerable ourselves so that we are able to appreciate the vulnerability of those around us.
And yet we live in a culture, a market culture, if you will, of self-interest and greed. We need more sensitizing voices like yours, John, to cut through to the prophetic mandate of Christ in our lives. Talk about your forthcoming book, If Christians Were really Christians.
Well, I think this is the thing. We play at the things that we do well. After we've done them for a while, we tend to pose rather than really to live. We almost behold ourselves on stage going through the actions of being Christians. And I think a lot of times we miss that radical note in the gospel. We miss the voice of Christ speaking to us because we are so used to doing this. We think we know what it's like to be Christians. We think that going to church and looking, pious on Sunday or whenever we go to church, that this is what's required of us. And it's over and over in the Gospels themselves. Jesus was accosting people who were much better at religion than we are and reminding them that that wasn't enough, that it was how they treated one another that lay at the very root of all true religion.
Let's get to that question about how much is enough or what's enough. In the stories you told, there's one where Jesus says, sell everything you have. Then Zacchaeus gives away half of what he has. And then we have the guy who gives 5 McDonald's breakfasts away. I mean, there's a big difference between those. How do you know what's the right amount for you to be doing?
That's a good question, but my own answer would be that each of us it has to do with spirit. That if we have a spirit to cooperate and to give, to be generous, we may give a little here and a little there and a little somewhere else and not give it all at once. Or I heard a story several years ago about a young couple who came to see a pastor who was a friend of mine out in Seattle, I think it was. And they told him that they had just inherited a large amount from the wife's aunt who had died, and they wanted to give it to the church or to somebody. And the pastor told them, well, go home and think about that. Maybe you don't really want to do that. Maybe you ought to keep it. And they said, no, we want to give it. And so they came back later, and he talked to them again, and they said, we still want to give it. And he said, okay, but he said, now I want you to keep it. They said, what do you mean keep it? He said, because now that you understand it isn't really yours, you can probably do more with it in your lifetime if you use it for others than if you give it all away now. It won't be your responsibility anymore. But he didn't want them to get by without having the responsibility of being available to people wherever they met them.
Like the widow's mite you told us about. It's what we do with what we have. And in her case, she had so little, but it was everything. In your book, you have a list that if we could only imagine the results of what would happen if everyone lit just one candle, if we could really take the faith seriously as witnesses to the faith. Can you share some of that list? I mean, it's a radical
You've
vision.
read it since I have, I'm afraid, Lydia.
I read some of it.
Did you?
That was
no, it's
given
been a
to us,
while since I gave it to the publishers.
But about our government and the world order and...
well, I mean, you know, there's so much to do. And we always assume that we've done everything. And we haven't even begun. I mean, take the trouble we're in now as a country and trying to provide for people all around us. There is so much to do, and we Christians just sort of sit back and allow it to happen as if we didn't, you know, have a thought or a voice. And we don't do much by example. There's so much. We could change the tone of the nation, the Christians could, and could change the tone of the world if we would all become Christ's people and had the generosity then that Christ asked of us.
In your book, you refer to a Thanksgiving in Los Angeles a few years ago when you and your wife, Ann, did something. And
oh, you're talking about the homeless man that came up. Yes, that was a sad but beautiful experience in its way. It was after Thanksgiving. We'd had the big Los Angeles Thanksgiving service at our church. Congregationalists always thought Thanksgiving belonged to them, so we this homeless man came up and he talked to my wife, and it turned out he was his parents had turned him out. He'd been mugged in the park that night, and we took care of him. We got him to a hospice and everything. My wife gave him a hug. And we got home, and a lady called up and said she had embarrassed me and the church by hugging this homeless man. I mean, you know, if Christians were really Christian.
Thank you, John Killinger.